Hey nerds, what's up? Absolute classic, The Left Hand of Darkness by legend Ursula K. Guin is being put up to the question that us dramasters like to ask about classics, which is it overrated? My answer? Yes and no. Admittedly, I had extremely high expectations when I went into this book since it's been on my TBR for years and I've heard so much about it. And while it absolutely delivered on the meaty aspects of thematic elements and having a lot of substance, I have to admit it did not meet expectations in terms of just being like a basically enjoyable book to read. I did not connect at all to the plot or the characters and just found it kind of a hard book to really feel invested in. Far from being the favorite I expected it to be, it was just sort of fine. So today we are going to dig into those thematic elements and talk about why I think The Left Hand of Darkness has been a mainstay in sci-fi for so long and has really stuck around, and also talk about maybe why it wasn't necessarily still the most enjoyable book to read. I'll see you after the jump. So let's dig into the thematic elements of The Left Hand of Darkness, of which there are many. But I think the one theme that is talked about the most, and so likely whether or not you have read the book, you have heard about the most, is its commentary on gender. If you haven't read the novel, one of the world building pieces is that on the planet in which The Left Hand of Darkness takes place, everybody on that planet is sexless and genderless for most of their existence. They live as a part of a cycle, and in a small part of that cycle, maybe a few days, called Kemmer, that part of the cycle is the only time sex happens, and in that case, pairs turn into opposite sexes for that brief period of time. Otherwise, nobody is viewed as male or female. The most interesting thing about this book, and the fact that this is the theme that is talked about the most with this book, is that it really is only a set piece for the rest of the novel. Really nothing about the plot itself has to do directly with this idea of genderless, sexless beings. It really is about, it's really just an element of the world that the novel takes place in. Of course, the whole point of that set piece is that it does influence how the world has developed, and that really is where Le Guin uses it to inform the rest of the novel, but it's not directly pertaining to the plot. I do think this is a boon in a lot of ways. I have complained a lot about recent sci-fi novels that I've read that feel like they need to explain their point to you constantly, that feel like they need to tell you exactly how they feel about it. And one of the most interesting things that I found about The Left Hand of Darkness, because of the way people talk about this novel, is that really this genderless, sexless thing wasn't like this main point. It wasn't the overarching idea of the novel. It was really clearly a thought piece that Le Guin put into the book, which I do think is a very rich way of exploring themes. Now, is this a feminist book like everyone says? Yes, I think The Left Hand of Darkness is feminist in that anything that is going to critically examine gender and how our society deals with gender is going to read as inherently feminist because of the way it's asking questions. However, I don't think it is the manifesto like people make it out to be, because it's really a book that is presenting ideas and questions more than answers and to-dos. One of the things I liked the most of this examination is that the character in which we view the whole story from, for the most part, the main character and the main viewpoint character, is a character who is not a native of this planet and so is male. And we see everything through their eyes, and they have a hard time viewing individuals as genderless because it is such an important piece of identity on Earth, right? It's such an important piece of identity for us. And that, I think, is the most interesting part of this exploration in this novel, is the idea of where does gender place when it is taken away from us, and how would we view that? And I think one of the reasons this has probably been such a mainstay and was so important at the time is, yes, it was published in 1969. And I feel like even today, it brings up a lot of interesting conversations that we are still having about gender and sex. And so in that way, a novel that can be written 50-ish years ago and still feel relevant and still bring up the same questions we as society are talking about today, that obviously means something. When someone can get to the heart of an issue in such a way that it still hasn't really changed in 50 years, yeah, that is why it's probably still around and why it's such an important piece of fiction. So her introduction to this particular version of the novel, I'm trying to think of when it was published, because this one actually, I was laughing because this copy I got says a new, never before published introductory essay. It's fantastic. I actually had read that introductory essay as a part of her collection of essays, so I'd read it previously. And I do think it's a really interesting essay to kind of understand the left hand of darkness. And I've actually quoted it in several other videos because it talks about how she doesn't feel that sci-fi is predictive, but rather sci-fi examines what is currently happening in today's society. So I think it is a really great piece to understand her thought process with the left hand of darkness. But there is another essay that I think does even more than that, and it can also be found in Language of the Night. It's called Is Gender Necessary? And it's really important if you do end up looking this up because you want to read it, that there's kind of a duel. So in this novel, the original essay Is Gender Necessary was published in 1976, and then she has an edit in 1998 where she makes notes on what she previously said and kind of changes her opinion on it. But I think this is actually very important as a context for the novel. So one of the things she talks about is regretting a little bit how she examined gender in The Left Hand of Darkness. For example, she talks about how she upheld heterosexuality so completely in Kemmer and in The Left Hand of Darkness, and that's something she really regrets. But another thing she regrets is that her main character defaulted to male pronouns for everybody when in fact they were genderless. So from the original part of the essay, it says, "This rises in part from the choice of pronoun. I call Guthenians he because I utterly refuse to mangle English by inventing a pronoun for he, she. He is the generic pronoun, damn it, in English. But I do not consider this really very important. The pronouns wouldn't matter at all if I had been cleverer at showing the female component of the Guthenian characters in action." And then her correction in 1988. "The utter refusal of 1968, restated in 1976, collapsed utterly within a couple of years more. I still dislike invented pronouns, but now dislike them less than the so-called generic pronoun he, him, his, which does in fact exclude women from discourse, and which was an invention of male grammarians, for until the 16th century the English generic singular pronoun was they, them, their, as it still is in English and American colloquial speech. It should be restored to the written language and let the pedants and pundits squeak and gibber in the streets. In a screenplay of The Left Hand of Darkness written in 1985, I referred to Guthenians not pregnant or in Kemmer by the invented pronouns a, un, a, modeled on a British dialect. These would drive the reader mad in print, I suppose, but I have read parts of the book aloud using them, and the audience was perfectly happy, except that they pointed out that the subject pronoun a, pronounced sounds too much like I said in a southern accent. I now consider this very important. If I had realized how the pronouns I use shaped, directed, and controlled my own thinking, I might have been cleverer." This was such an interesting thing to read after reading The Left Hand of Darkness because I considered it a very conscious character choice on Le Guin's part to use he, him, his pronouns from the main character because the main character was male. And so I thought, of course, he would see through a lens that everyone around him was a default male. I also thought in my head, wow, wouldn't it have been interesting if the main character was female and how that would have changed? Would a female default to seeing everyone as he, him, or would it be she, her? I really thought it was a character choice that the male main character could not see past his own ideas of gender. And so her thought of, I would have changed that, is curious to me because it makes it seem like less of a character choice. Of course, that wouldn't be bad. It would just make the novel feel very different if the character had automatically accepted the gender-neutral pronouns. However, to her point, I did notice that as a reader, her usage of the male pronouns did make me automatically read everybody as male by default. Despite being told that they were genderless, the fact that the main character uses he, his, made me picture men for the most part when I read the novel. And if that was not her intention, then I do think that's such an interesting exploration of what the book would say differently if that had been changed. On to that, there's one other quote I wanted to read from this dual perspective. "It seems to be men more often than women who thus complete my work for me. I think because men are more often willing to identify as they read with poor, confused, defensive Genly, the Earthman, and therefore to participate in his painful and gradual discovery of love." And this correction. "I now see it thus. Men were inclined to be satisfied with the book, which allowed them a safe trip into androgyny and back from a conventionally male viewpoint. But many women wanted it to go further, to dare more, to explore androgyny from a woman's point of view as well as a man's. In fact, it does so in that it was written by a woman, but this is admitted directly only in the chapter The Question of Sex, the only voice of a woman in the book. I think women were justified in asking more courage of me and more rigorous thinking through of the implications. I think it was so funny that I had the thought, wow, I wonder what this book would have been different if it was from a female perspective, and that Le Guin herself actually questioned that later on. My point in all of this is that I think The Left Hand of Darkness still asks a lot of interesting questions about gender and sex, but that they're often misrepresented in a lot of reviews and general feelings about the book that I've seen. I don't necessarily think that the book is trying to say one thing. I think instead the book is trying to explore what we place on sex and gender. And I think reading the author's words about how her viewpoint changed from when she read the book to when she wrote that essay, Is Gender Necessary, about 10 years later, and then to another revision 10 years after that, is a really interesting viewpoint in how society and our own views can change throughout life about complicated issues. And in that, I think, is why The Left Hand of Darkness has captured people for so long. But yes, gender seems to be the only thing that's really discussed when we talk about The Left Hand of Darkness, whereas I think there are a lot more overt themes in other ways, particularly since I said gender doesn't really play into the plot directly. Really, the plot is about anti-war sentiment, patriotism, and loyalty. What does patriotism mean? And what does loyalty mean to a country, to a person, to a lover, to a friend? And these ideas of patriotism and what it means to be loyal to a country and anti-war sentiment makes a lot of sense for the late 60s. And I think there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had there about how you feel about the main character that isn't the Earthman and the decisions they make, and do you view them as loyal or not loyal, and when was it detrimental to be loyal to their countrymen? I'm just surprised those things aren't talked about more. And I think it's probably because it's not as spicy is the wrong word, but like I think it is easier and often more interesting for us to take the easy thing, which is like, wow, look at that, no gender, versus the plot, which really is talking about war and patriotism. So this brings me into my personal enjoyment of the novel, which just wasn't a lot. I mean, let me be clear. I am always about a book that makes me think, and a book that allowed me to talk this long about the thematic elements and really made me want to dig into the author's words and think about it is never going to be a book I hate. I could never. You know, I gave this 3 stars, and that was mostly to reflect how much thought it provoked in me. I just think this book would have been a lot more enjoyable for me if I actually had studied it in school or as a part of a book club. And I know everyone gives studying books in school such a rough time. I think there are books that are really nice to read a chapter and then discuss it. I think that would have been perfect for this. Like, read a chapter and then go dig deep into the meaty aspects of it. But did I enjoy it? Not really. I thought it got really boring at points. I'm gonna be honest. I thought the characters were super stilted and just didn't do a lot for me. And I'm a huge character reader. Now I know the end part, which I don't want to give away, that lasts forever. I think it's 80 pages, but it feels like 800. I know there's a purpose to that. I know they did that purposely. She did it purposely so it felt slow and long and really got you into the theme of survival and what that means. But I just didn't enjoy it, and I can like a really slow book. I'm just gonna say it. It just felt a lot of how I felt about Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was another book that did I enjoy the book itself that much? No. Did I enjoy the thematic elements and the thoughts? Absolutely. Did it deserve to win? Yes. I was gonna say, well, I haven't read any of the other books, so I'm not qualified to say, but I found out I did read one of the other books, which was Slaughterhouse-Five, which is one of my favorite books I've ever read. It's incredible. So I guess I liked that book more. So would I have given the award to Slaughterhouse-Five? Maybe. It's also just as, I think, relevant today as it has ever been. And also anti-war, not surprising again for the year. That being said, Again, even though I didn't personally enjoy the book, I obviously understand why it won and understand why it's captured everyone still to this day. Because again, when an author can really transcend time and really pinpoint issues that will continue to be relevant, I think that is something to be celebrated. Now, ideally, this happens in a book that's also enjoyable to read, like Slaughterhouse-Five, or like The Three-Body Problem, or, you know, there's a lot of ways to love a book and have deep themes. So I enjoyed it, just not necessarily going to be a new favorite. That's kind of my track record with Ursula K. Le Guin anyway. Some stuff I've read of hers I've loved, and some stuff just has been like, okay. It's not always 100% with me for her. Okay, so that's my feelings on The Left Hand of Darkness. Is it overrated? No, because I completely understand why it has grabbed our culture so much, and I think it's a very important novel. Did I personally love it and 5-star read? No, and that's okay too. So tell me why I'm wrong and why this is your favorite book. Although I will admit, when I gave my 3-star review, everyone was raving about it, and then suddenly everyone came out of the woodworks to be like, me too. I think people are afraid to say they didn't enjoy the book. So no fear here. You can tell me what you thought about it. Tell me what you thought about the themes of the book. I'd love to know your thoughts. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.